Okay, I've called this short presentation Points of Departure because these really are just notes for discussion. Divi criticism is still at a relatively early stage. Reviewing the drama of Sing and O'Casey, Raymond Williams spoke of the pressing poverty behind that endless fantasy of Irish talk. You get a lot of overcompensating active speech in a Divi play, or poets talking, as Begin Mike says of Christy Mann in Sing's Playboy. Extreme, exorbitant, excessive utterance is characteristic of Divi's women, and they don't depend on men to deliver them from poverty through poetry. As well as endless talk, Divi delivers some formidable talking back. The conjunction between poetic speech and poverty of opportunity is one on which she dwells. In Ulysses, James Joyce has old gummy granny present herself as Ireland's sweetheart, the King of Spain's daughter. Later, Stephen tells Bloom that Kitty O'Shea is the King of Spain's daughter. Neither allusion appears favourable. Here I want to pursue another Joycean connection. In a podcast on Dubliners in January 2013, Sebastian Barry said, "I chose Evelyn because 40 years later, I am still not over it. The scene at the dockside, I am still inclined to cry out the same thing I cried out the first time I read it, age 17, get on the bloody boat, Evelyn." Thanks to the work of Katie Millen and others, we now know Evelyn may have been wise to resist going aboard, as she could have been pressed into service of a particularly demeaning kind by Frank, her sailor suitor. As Mullen argues, Joyce's infusion of anti-emigration fiction with the white slave cautionary tale serves to complicate his heroine's renunciation of her apparent escape route. Then again, the spectre of servitude loomed at home as well as abroad. There is a remarkable essay published in 1929 by Senior Toksvig, Why Girls Leave Ireland, that sheds light on Evelyn and on Divi, whom Toksvig knew, with whom she corresponded, and to whom she showed work in progress. Toksvig, a Danish author ultimately driven back home by Irish censorship, tells of a walk on a soft day in a southern Irish county and an encounter with three sisters of her maid Molly. Molly is the type who aims for America, so Toksvig is curious about her younger siblings. I looked at Katie. She was about 4 and looked 2, dressed in rags and with little naked blue-grey feet in the cold, deep mud. Katie was very dirty. Katie was a sight. The 2 older girls were not much better. They had 3 or 4 miles to walk home. At the moment, there was nothing I could do about it, but my thoughts took a juster turn. When this little Katie grew up and became some other housekeeper's problem, would they really see her? No, no more than I was doing, although I knew all the facts. But the facts, so tangibly dramatised, of my own troubles, had put the others out of my mind. Katie in the mud, however, knocked them back in again. And the answer is, why wouldn't they go to America? And why wouldn't they be raw when they get there? The word raw refers back to how Toksvig's friends would speak of getting a raw Irish girl as a servant. In Joyce's Evelyn, it is the man who is the romantic adventurer. Evelyn herself is speechless throughout the story, never uttering a solitary syllable. She makes herself heard just once. Amid the seas, she sent a cry of anguish. That's her exit line. The ending of Evelyn has been much debated, and Divi's drama deserves the same assiduous attention to detail as it possesses the same degree of poetic depth. Una Keeley's recent essay on the King of Spain's daughter is a brilliant example of exactly the kind of subtle and theoretically informed criticism Divi demands, and she invites us to think more deeply about the play's ending. Evelyn Hill was a domestic drudge with a brutal father who dreamt of getting away. Like Joyce, and yet not like Joyce, Divi approached her would-be escapees quite unsentimentally. The King of Spain's daughter opens with Annie Kinsella, an adventurous young woman of 20 with a great imagination, giving a long kiss to Roddy Mann, while resisting both the advances of Jim Harris, her would-be suitor, and the threats of her father that he'll sign her over to the factory for 5 years if he doesn't settle down and behave herself. Jim is a saver, and one of the things Jim says he wants to save is Annie, as she is, not as a reluctant gift from her father. She's as she is, he says, a dreamer and a desirer of other men, because she must. She's made that way. She can't help it. Jim is painted in flattering tones in the play's opening, standing up for Annie in her absence against both her father and Mrs. Marks, the neighbour. Annie's philandering, as her father calls it, is in stark contrast to Jim's apparent steadfast love. When Mrs. Marks, the neighbour, urges him to give up on Annie, Jim retorts, "Give up me life, is it?" But when Annie appears with Roddy Mann in tow, we see another side of Jim, jealous, petty, willing to stand by while Annie is beaten by her father. And there's something else. In an early exchange with Mrs. Marks, Jim is advised against pursuing Annie because her head is full of folly and her heart is full of wile. Mrs. Marks appeals to his sense of domestic responsibility. "You have two good sisters. Can't you settle with them or get a sensible girl?" Which Jim dismisses as a lot of old talk. Jim's two good sisters come back into the play, mentioned by name, when Annie reluctantly agrees to marry him and Jim says distractedly, "I'll tell them look out for a place so they can get a room in the town." "Tell who?" asks Annie. "Molly and Dot. 'Tis I have the house. They knew they'd have to go." Annie's response demonstrates her ability to think and see beyond herself. "Well then, they needn't. Let them stop where they are. What would I do without a woman to talk to?" "I want you to myself." I never heard the like. A good man he'd make, to begin by turning his two sisters on the road, and they after minding the place since his mother died. The disagreement escalates when Jim takes Annie's reaction as a marriage deal breaker. "Will you go back on me so?" "Leave Molly and Dot stay where they are." "I will not." "What great harm would they do?" "They'd be in it, spoiling the world." "Spoiling the world? I think you're crazy." "When we shut the house door, I'll have no one in it but you and me." Jim begins to sound worryingly familiar to Annie, so much so that she says, "I think I'll stop with my father." Gerardine Meany makes precisely this point. Jim, who offers to throw his sisters out of his house to facilitate the marriage, seems more like her father than initial appearances had suggested. His true colours come out, the same prison grey as those of the bride's dress that Annie splashed with rainbow romance. Jim points out that with her father comes a factory, so Annie suggests she might run away, to which Jim counters, "He'd go after you, he'd have you crippled." This is the point at which Jim pulls out the savings account and mentions the £20 he scraped together over 4 years. Money for him and Annie, but money too that Molly and Dot, minding the house, could have done with. If Jim is a saver rather than a saviour, and mean with it, then Molly and Dot are two of the unseen, unheard characters in Davies' drama, mentioned by name, spoken of by Jim, and spoken for in sisterhood and solidarity by Annie. In a fascinating account of Joyce's Evelyn, Joanna Luft points out that while readers have assumed that the two young children who had been left to her charge are her siblings, the text makes clear that her brothers and sisters were all grown up, leading Luft to observe the absence of an immediate familial tie between Evelyn and her charges reduces her obligation to remain in Dublin, yet they are certainly part of the home that her mother enjoins her to keep together. Luft's observation of the notion of a reduced obligation is problematic. A familial tie is a complex thing. In Davies' play, Annie rebukes Jim for being prepared to abandon his sisters and taking on Annie as his new exclusive family. Annie's compassion is not fueled by an immediate family tie, yet she is ready to break off her prospective tie to Jim due to his cold-heartedness towards Molly and Dot. Unlike Evelyn, Annie is not taken by, in the broadest sense, a single man. She's taken by the bride with the dress of many colours, just as Ellie Irwin, in Search of Valor, was not enamoured of any man, but beguiled by another girl, Charlotta Buck, playing a man using only her voice, performing active speech out of costume. Annie feels compassion and the need for female friendship at Jim's suggestion that he'll turn his sisters out of the house when he marries her. But it transpires that she fears the factory more than she fears settling down. Synge's shadow is always in the background of Davies' drama. Gerardine Meany, in an excellent discussion of the King of Spain's Daughter and the politics of violence and the family, calls it an occluded parody of the Playboy of the Western world. The echoes of Synge's Playboy are as intriguing as those of Joyce's Evelyn, but the match-up of Annie as Pegeen Mike, Roddy Mann as Christy Mann, and Jim Harris as Sean Keogh is complicated by the fact that Annie is the playgirl and she doesn't lose her only playboy, for behind Roddy is another beau, Jack Bolger, unseen and unimportant to Annie, but pulled out of the hat by others as proof of her unreliability. As Jim says, we're all the one, you have no heart. We're all the one, all men are the same, that's Jim's fear, a fear he later fleshes out with fact, hoisted by his own patriarchal petard. The King of Spain's Daughter opens with a stage direction that locates Annie in a grassy space between a sign saying no traffic and another saying road closed. Later, Annie laments, where would I ever find a way out of here? It looks like there's no way out except for the fields beyond or the river where the by-turns, envied and pitied new bride set sail. The title of Deavy's play comes from a poem by Patrick Collum entitled A Drover. At one point, Annie recites a verse softly to herself and Jim barks back, I'm sick of that thing. Who's the King of Spain's daughter? Annie answers, it is myself I seen in her, sailing out into the sun and to adventure. At the play's end, Annie reacts to the suggestion that Jim is a good boy and she should be a good girl by saying, he put by 2 shillings every week for 200 weeks. I think he is a man that, supposing he was jealous, might cut your throat. The stage direction reads, quiet, exultant, she goes, leaving Mrs. Marks, the neighbour, to lament, the Lord preserve us that she'd find joy in such a thought. Una Keeley has addressed this ending with considerable clarity and integrity of purpose. Is it all talk or active speech? Annie is, like Deavy's Ellie Irwin in an earlier one-act play, a fearless talker. She is also a character who can usefully be set alongside Joyce's Evelyn, as someone whose dreams of leaving are dashed, but how far and to what effect? According to Kathy Leaney, reasons for the extraordinarily low marriage rate in Ireland in the 1920s and 1930s include the legacy of the famine, as well as primogeniture, fear of poverty involved in having a large family, lack of means and of employment, and the likelihood of emigration, while for women, marriage usually meant loss of financial independence and emotional and physical vulnerability to the will of their husbands. Speaking of Deavy's drama, Leaney observes, Annie Kinsella imagines a marriage as a rite of passage into adventure. This vision of a transforming imagination is necessary in enabling her to survive the reality of matrimony, the loss of herself. Her instinctive understanding of this danger is the very stuff of the play. For one of her biographers, Frances Clark, a central preoccupation in much of Deavy's drama is the condition of high-spirited, imaginative young women in rural Ireland who are forced to reject romantic aspirations in the face of an unglamorous, unchanging reality. An early review of the published version of the play concluded with a familiar misogynist trope. The King of Spain's Daughter is a one-act taming, perhaps, of one of Miss Deavy's temperamental shrews. Is Annie tamed? In his study of Deavy's one-act plays, Stephen Murray says of The King of Spain's Daughter that the central theme is that marriage is a disappointment, but that by numbing one's sensibilities, one can put up with it. Is Annie numb at the end? Or conversely, perversely, is she still romancing, still fantasising passionately about a different life? It's been argued that Annie wishes for a romantic, epic life, and this dreaming is scorned by the other characters. The lamentation of Synge's Pegeen, oh my grief, I've lost him surely, I've lost the only playboy of the Western world, is supplanted in Deavy's play by Annie's exultation. I think he is a man that, supposing he was jealous, might cut your throat. A statement that echoes the reception of Christy Mann rather than his departure. This is where we come in with Synge. For when Pegeen hears of Christy's propensity for violence, she says, if I'd that lad in the house, I wouldn't be fearing the loosed khaki cutthroats or the Walking Dead. Annie dreams of a dramatic departure from the life she leads, from her father, the factory, and an emotionally frugal husband, even if it means a dramatic death. Geraldine Meany puts it nicely and icily when she remarks dryly, instead of pretending to be a murderer, Annie Kinsella can ultimately hope only to be interestingly murdered. But is her final wish for a man who would cut her throat through jealousy part of Annie's dream? I began with Evelyn at the gangway, clinging to the guardrail. Did she stay or did she go? What should she have done? We still don't know. The jury's out on Annie too. Is she in the end another victim of male violence, wishing fatalistically for more, or an imaginative and independent-minded woman looking out for other women and talking back to men, or both and more besides? Drama at its most dynamic, like Davies, encourages diversity of interpretation. Thank you.